He was Time magazine's first social media editor, created the editorial social media team at Bloomberg and Businessweek, and then served as director of news at Facebook. Now he's a digital news entrepreneur. All this, and he's just 5 years out of college. My guest today, Dan Fletcher, co-founder of Beacon, a startup that connects readers and writers to fund their reporting. I'm Lawrence Pintak, founding dean of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. And this is the Murrow Interview. Dan, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me.
So you can't keep a job, huh?
You and my dad, always on my case about that. I can't say this was the path I really anticipated. Like, when I first came out of school, I still had in my head that first job would be something I worked for 5 or 6 years. But it seems like people hop around now. Like, I don't think this pattern for me is all that uncommon. All my friends are on their 3rd or 4th gig too.
Well, we're taping today in front of a live audience at WSU Vancouver, and I'm sure there are plenty of students who are saying, 5 years out of school? I can do that too. Pretty cool. You worked at Time, you worked at Bloomberg, et cetera. What did you take away from this quick tour through, as they say, legacy media?
First off, I got to say I enjoyed the tour through legacy media. The reason I wanted to do a startup wasn't necessarily to escape in any way. It's just that what's exciting to me, and I think what has kept me moving around, is the idea that there's a lot of change that needs to be done in the news business. Some of that's going to be tackled by legacy news publications, and a lot of it's going to happen in the startup world. And for me, and sort of my interests in what I was wanting to do, a startup seemed like a really great path to do it.
I'm going to embarrass one of our colleagues in the audience, Scott Campbell of the local newspaper here in Vancouver, the Columbian. I have a copy of the paper in front of me, and with one of the front page stories, it says, "On the web, videos that tell this story." How well are legacy media like that handling this whole transition?
I think it's tough to generalize, and I think the ones that are doing well recognized 5 or 6 years ago that this transition was coming and really sort of got out in front of it. In some cases, it's required a change of ownership too. Like the New Republic, for example, was a little bit moribund before Chris Hughes, who was one of the early co-founders of Facebook, jumped in and really started pushing digital first. I don't think anyone has the answers. I don't think even folks who are doing well would admit that they have the answers. I think it's just a matter of trying to find things that work in the moment and trying to guess what comes next.
When we first met a year or so ago, I didn't even know there was a head of news at Facebook. And then by the time you got done with your visit to our campus, there was no head of news at Facebook. Tell me a little bit about your, how you worked through that transition and why you took that transition out of Facebook.
So my job at Facebook was, I was their first managing editor. And they gave me a call when I was at Bloomberg and said, look, we want to do something with content. We don't know what that means. We really have no idea, but we want you to come help us figure that out. So it's worth noting, technology companies don't know what to do with storytelling on the web either. They're trying to figure it out. Twitter, Tumblr, they've all had similar initiatives like this. When we got in, we had pretty broad purview in the beginning to tell stories about technology's impact in the world. And as a journalist, that was a really edifying mission. The problem, and you've seen this at a lot of tech companies who have started content initiatives, is that there's not necessarily an appetite to take risks. When you pitch a story, it's very easy for a business who's viewing this as marketing primarily to sit and list all the ways that it will be risky to them or that the messaging will be off. And to me, that's not necessarily something that lends itself to really good journalism. And throughout my time at Facebook, we butted heads in a few different instances about stories I wanted to do and stories that they weren't comfortable with, and exactly what is the mission of this, and ultimately what was the point. And I think what we learned, and I mean this was sort of the takeaway from this interview, is that Facebook doesn't necessarily need to create its own content to be successful. They don't need journalists filling their pipes with information. Because honestly, they have that already. The New York Times posts 30 times a day with their news stories. Bloomberg News dumps in their latest headlines to Facebook all the time. they're getting content from legacy media organizations on their platform already. It doesn't necessarily make sense to create it themselves. So for me, it was, in my mind, a battle I was never going to win. And with so much opportunity out there, I felt like it was time to jump off.
And you jumped to the classic startup. Tell me about what you're doing.
So we live in we is me and my two co-founders, Adrian and Dimitri. We live in a pink house in suburban Sunnyvale, which is a harsh transition coming from New York City. Like a big night out for us is going to In-N-Out. We have an AstroTurf backyard. There are dragons painted on the back fence, none of the doors aligned. So it's like your classic startup house. And we agreed
Except you're not working in the garage.
We're not working in the garage. The garage is sadly where we cook. I told my dad I got a grill. It's a George Foreman grill. He said, you got a hot plate. We got into this program called Y Combinator. And Y Combinator is, I'm biased, but probably the best startup accelerator in the United States. What they do is they basically make you sit in a room with each other. And during the course of this 3 months, you're either going to kill each other, or you're going to have a successful startup come out of it, and you're going to sort of get to the next round of funding. So Adrian, Dimitri, and myself all agreed that we were going to lock ourselves up in the suburb at the beginning of the year and really see what we could build and see what we can try to do. And it's been a lot of work, but you see why this works. You see why startups start this way, in people's garages or in the backyard, because it's just so easy and so effortless to toss ideas around and have everyone be on the same page. And that's something that was always a struggle, sort of in legacy media organizations.
Easy to toss ideas around, less easy to get money?
You know, it's a good moment actually for media startups. I wouldn't have said this a year ago. When I jumped off of Facebook, funding was a real concern in my mind because everyone's like,
yes.
Yeah, well, besides my personal funding. Everyone a year ago was saying content was dead. The news business is dead. Look at all these publishers, they're laying off all these people. But there's a herd mentality to funding and sort of to startups, I think. And when Vox Media, which is a publisher of The Verge and Polygon, really good web brands, when they're able to raise a big Series A, people notice. When Pierre Omidyar, founder of eBay, hires Glenn Greenwald away from The Guardian and says, let's create a news organization, people notice. When something like Bleacher Report has a big exit, people notice. So there's much more of an appetite and a willingness right now to figure out what is the content that's sort of native to the internet and how do we support it? And it's that last bit, how do we support it? How do we build a monetary model that actually supports the people who do the writing, the photography, the videography that makes the web great? That has a lot of particular interest, both to us and I think in venture capital right now. Certainly
a question some of the legacy editors in the room are also asking, though.
Yeah.
How do you build that model?
I don't think anyone has the answer. My point of view on this, though, is that we were sold a really crappy bill of goods with web advertising. The promise of web advertising was that if I was passionate about something, and if I was able to attract an audience to it, that ultimately I would develop the means of supporting myself online. I mean, this was the dream of every single WordPress blog. I was this person in college. I had a photography blog. I put the Google AdWords on my site, and I had a story that hit the front page of Yahoo. I made 30 bucks. Like, web advertising is not going to...
Which is what some newspapers are making these days.
Well, I know, it's a thing. I mean, you look at the Huffington Post, they make $5 for every 1,000 people who come to the site. It's a $5 CPM. And what that means is that the only content you can create are things that take no risks whatsoever. They're things that are very, very broadly relevant and have a very high probability of being popular. And I learned this myself at Time. I mean, I was part of this change at Time. Like, my job when I was there was to sit, comb Twitter, try and figure out what people were going to tweet about, and write an article before they did so they would tweet our link out. Like, you're attempting to game the system to get people back to the site because that's what web advertising requires you to do. So to me, the model of the future, this will work, but it will work only for the people who are really, really good at it and have a level of sophistication, sometimes even algorithmic sophistication, to predict what will be popular, which is BuzzFeed, for example. Or folks who are able to create an audience that's so well-defined and so affluent that they're able to charge a much, much higher rate for advertising on the web. So that's Vox's model. They do super premium ads that cost a lot of money. It's Quartz, it's Business Week, it's places like that. Web advertising will sustain them, but it's still going to be a grind, and there's still downward pressure on those rates. For everyone else, which is a lot of the content that we care about, and things that are important, things that are niche interests, that are underrepresented on the web, that model doesn't exist yet. And that's what I think we're really keen to figure out at Beacon.
I'm Lawrence Pintak. This is the Murrow Interview, and my guest is Dan Fletcher, one of the co-founders of Beacon. So let's circle back. What is Beacon? What's this next great thing that's going to emerge from the pink house?
Beacon takes a look at a lot of the activities that have happened on social networks in the past 3 or 4 years. I think this is an idea that's only possible now, excuse me. When you look at what's happened in the news business in the past 3 or 4 years, the atomic unit of how people interact with news has broken down from the brand to the individual. That's what's happened with Facebook and Twitter. People have a relationship now with the individual reporter, regardless of the brand that they work at. They follow them, they retweet them, they get their news from them, they're providing this curated experience. And that's awesome for Facebook and Twitter, because again, it's all this content that fills their pipes. It's less awesome for the reporters who spend all day on Twitter and don't get any money from it. So the fundamental crux of the idea at Beacon was, if a reporter has this following that they've built up over the three or four past years, what's the best way to get support from them to actually allow them to create new work? So the way Beacon works is it's a $5 a month subscription. We started with 28 reporters. We're at 100 now. Readers come to the site. They choose one reporter who they're interested in supporting. That reporter takes home 70% of their subscription every single month. And in exchange, the reader gets access to their stories and every story by every writer on Beacon.
So the reporter gets 70% of $5.
75% of that $5 subscription each month. So you need some subscriptions to make it work. We'll get to that.
Okay.
On the reader side, we'll get to how it works, I'm sure, on the writer side. On the reader side, what I really like about this model is what you're trying to construct is a little bit like the Netflix for news. And Netflix for news is something that's been bandied about in the startup world for a long, long time. It's tough to do because it's tough to get brands from different companies to agree to do anything. But really what this is every single month we add on new writers. And if I'm supporting you, and this month I add on 30 science writers, I still get to read those 30 science writers. We're making the subscription stronger every single month by adding new reporters with new interests. And I think that that's something legacy media brands can't necessarily match.
But where are these reporters coming from? Are they, if they have a following, are they not coming from legacy media?
Our group right now is primarily freelancers. So they're using legacy media as a chance to sort of build that following. You know, what I say to people is there are absolutely no shortage of opportunities to do brand building on the web. If you want to write and you want to syndicate something out in a massive audience to see it, I can think of 10 places for you to go to try and do that. What's missing is anywhere that's going to actually pay you a decent rate for that story. So the reporters who are successful on Beacon are very savvy in that they continue to have freelance clients in regular media. They continue to use things like Medium to sort of build their brand and spread what they're doing. And then Beacon becomes the place to take that top 10% of their readership and funnel them into people who actually pay to support their work.
In some ways, you're going against the tide. I mean, it's all about aggregation up until now, right?
Yeah, and that's what I love about it. I mean, I think really good companies often go against the tide. What I love is that everyone's still running to try and figure out how to make free work. And at least where I'm sitting, there doesn't seem to be a way to do it.
But isn't content supposed to be free? Isn't that the mantra?
I think that, well, I disagree with the mantra. I think that because we went into the internet with this assumption that everything had to be free, that it had to be broadly available, the quality of that information has actually decreased and is continuing to decrease. It's becoming a race to the bottom to keep that ideal. And I don't know why we don't go back and question that premise fundamentally to begin with. Like, why does everything have to be free? If free content is going to support cat videos and top 10 lists about where you should live in the US, like, that's fine. That content should be free. It isn't necessarily going to support, well, I mean, you may pay for it. I'm not going to pay for it. It isn't going to support great storytelling from Yemen. It isn't going to support investigative journalism just because, you know, the audience for those things are smaller. But they're deeply engaged, and engagement, I think, is what people will pay for.
How does, I mean, you say reporting from Yemen. How does a reporter who's sitting in Yemen, who's incurring all of the huge costs of being overseas, and, you know, as a former network correspondent, the amount of money that was spent to have me travel around is huge. How do you begin to cover that? How do you begin to absorb that in this kind of a model?
I think we're on the front end of it. And I think part of it is communicating the tremendous cost of actually doing this sort of foreign reporting. I don't think readers know that. No. I don't think people actually understand the costs of news production. I think they notice when the quality of information is bad, but they don't necessarily understand why. And I mean, I don't profess that at Beacon we have this completely cracked yet. I think we're 5% into figuring out like how to actually support that. Like what you just outlined there is sort of the guiding light. Like right now we're able to make that reporter probably $500 or $600 extra a month. It's good. Like it's a freelance story that they don't have to pitch out. They don't have to deal with editors. They can publish, and it's reliable money every month. And what we learned too, actually working with a freelancer in Yemen, is how bad legacy media is on paying their bills to freelancers on time. Yeah. We started a site called Pay Me Please, which is just like name and shame for all the.
I like it.
Yeah, it's great. So we had the BBC, we had like 14 listings for them on the first day the site launched, and they settled it up immediately. Nice. So, I mean, if we can help people make that money that way too, like I'm game to do it. But what you outlined there is the guiding light. How do we actually support someone in this country to do in-depth investigative reporting? And I think we'll get there. Like subscriptions is certainly one mechanism to help. We're experimenting with crowdfunding now as another mechanism to help. I don't think there's going to be a silver bullet that solves it. I think it's going to be trying to find a dozen different ways for the reporter to spread the word about why what they're doing is important and why it's deserving of support.
What about credibility? I mean, people read the New York Times because they know that at some level it's credible. It's edited. Do you have editing? Where's the credibility?
I think the credibility really relies on the individual freelancer themselves. And again, when we talk about sort of this unbundling of news, I think individuals earn credibility on social media. So we don't have an editing staff at Beacon ourselves. We've had writers on the platform who have sort of self-organized and edit each other's work, which is really interesting. To have someone in the Ukraine edit someone in Yemen before their story goes up is
it's kind of frightening.
A little bit frightening, but also interesting. Frightening but interesting is sort of the startup mantra, so I'm comfortable with that. What we tell people is like the greatest asset you have, particularly for something like this, is your credibility. I think readers are willing to forgive grammatical errors. I think they're willing to forgive janky spellings here and there, not a ton, but a little bit. But
you realize, of course, as a dean of a journalism school, that really frightens me.
Oh, I know. It frightens me too. It's just the trend as I see it. I think people are used to writing on the web being 80% there. They're used to this idea that there is this collaboration where readers in the comment sections on an article will say, no, this isn't quite right, or no, you should go back and look at this. And reporters do. They don't always disclose when they make these fixes. I think that there should be a commitment to transparency. If you change something in a story, you should let people know. But this happens.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that in this startup mentality that most of the focus up until now has been on the technology rather than the content?
It's a big problem. I think the focus has been twofold. The focus has been on building better tools for journalists to do the work that they do. And then the focus has been on reinventing what the end product looks like online and how you interact with it. And to me, like, those are interesting things, sure. But those are things that you figure out after you've cracked the model for actually supporting the content production to begin with. When you're building tools, you can have the best set of tools in the world, but if you can't afford to put someone in the situation where they actually can make use of them, what good is the tool? And I think actually tools at this point are largely commoditized. There are so many different ways to write and publish on the web, so many ways to do so in a design that looks great, that I don't understand why we're still building tools. The second bit, what the article looks like and functions online, I think that there's this perception that people read differently on a phone or that they read differently on a screen. And many people disagree with me on this one, but I don't necessarily buy that. I think a good article is a good article, and I think people will take the time and invest if they feel like it's worth their time or if they care about the subject matter. The reason I think we have this rush to reinvent the article is that a lot of the articles we're putting out are very bad. And we think that by changing the form or changing the packaging or putting a pretty little bow on it, that we can hide that fact. And I think, again, if you solve the model for how this content is produced, you can go back and figure out what's the best way to display it and what are the tools we need to make. And then that's a much more compelling experience as a whole.
But there have been other experiments at long form on tablets, on the web, that have not panned out.
I think there have. I think there have been problems with each of them. With the tablet in particular, let's start there. The great promise of Newsstand, which was Apple's magazine app, is that it makes publishing on the iPad really, really easy. The problem is that, and we experienced this a little bit with Beacon ourselves, journalists aren't great technologists. They're great at writing stories, they're great at finding stories, they're not great at the technology behind it.
Or the marketing.
Or the marketing behind it. So asking them to create a Newsstand app, while it may not require like an engineer's level of technical sophistication, is still a very big undertaking. And then asking them to market and find an audience on their own, entirely on their own, for this subscription is a big undertaking. And also, all of these things are going it alone. I don't think people want to pay a $5 a month subscription to 20 people. I think they want to pay a $5 a month subscription that gives them access to 20 people, and 20 becomes 40 next month. Like, you just get to a point where you have purchasing fatigue or support fatigue. And I think this is even what Kickstarter runs into. Because that support isn't ongoing, you may fund your first project for 6 months, but then you got to go back and you got to ask people for money again in 6 months. I'd rather journalists have to hustle up the support once and then know that support's ongoing than ask them to do this time and time again.
But how do you fight the fact that there is an unlimited amount of information available to us? I can, I'm on my iPad here, I can look at newspapers around the world, information overload. You're adding more information, you're asking for money for it. What's the added benefit that you're offering?
The added benefit is that the reader gets a say in the information that's produced. Like in this model, money essentially becomes votes. If I subscribe to the New York Times and I want the New York Times to cover Kurdistan, I can write a letter to the editor, I can mention I'm a subscriber.
And it's going to be really helpful.
It's going to work really, really well. Like it's just, you have no say in what they produce. I mean, that's the model. With us, we had a reporter who's on the ground in Kurdistan who joined Beacon. And a group of Iranian Kurds in Amsterdam went door to door within this Kurdish community to generate enough subscriptions to make her support ongoing on Beacon, to like help her get to her goal. And they would never do that for the Times because they don't get a say in what the Times produces. But this, they like the reporter, they believe in what she's covering. They actually will go out and fundraise on behalf of her to help make it possible.
But where's the line then of them influencing what she's writing?
So we're very clear that the reporter ultimately makes the decisions, and there's no expectation that the reader gets a say in the stories the reporter produces. I mean, there's a comment section on the article. We have a function called discussions. There's certainly places for people to provide feedback, but it's much more the reporter, it still is a broadcast mentality where the reporter decides what's important and delivers that to the reader.
But if that reporter knows that the Kurdish community in wherever Amsterdam went out and raised money, he or she knows that if she writes something that's going to tee them off, that money is going to disappear.
But I think journalists have always had a responsibility to their audience, and journalists have always had to find and develop an audience. Our model might be a bit more direct, and I do think that that's a concern, and it's something we'll have to figure out. And I think the more transparent reporters can be, the better. But this has always happened in some form or another.
We also have in the audience today the outgoing editor of the Oregonian. We have the general manager of KGW-TV. Both these organizations, like many of their peers, are struggling with this digital transition. The cliched question of the globe, what's coming up? Where do you see all of this in 10 years?
I think the greatest premium is going to be on personality. And you're seeing this already now in the traditional news business. It's the trend we're keying off of as well. Someone like Ezra Klein's able to leave the Washington Post and take his audience with him. He isn't dependent necessarily on the Washington Post to fund or to deliver his work. He can go and find someone to support it. Same with Nate Silver at the Times going to ESPN. I mean, these are really, really marquee examples, but I think it does sort of flow down the stack. I think that social media has created an environment in which people will seek out and engage with reporters on an individual basis. And the onus is on traditional media to sort of allow their brand to recede a little bit, to become a bit more of a platform, and put these individuals front and center, because they're going to serve as the places of discovery and really the way news will circulate around the web.
I'm Lawrence Pintak, and this is the Murrow Interview. My guest, Dan Fletcher of the startup Beacon. You mentioned social media. You're a skeptic of Twitter.
I am a data-driven skeptic of Twitter. When we started Beacon, I wondered if it was going to be a game of going out and finding the reporters with the largest Twitter followings and trying to pitch them on getting on board. But what we found is that Twitter is actually really bad at driving subscriptions. Facebook and email, Facebook's 2-to-1 over Twitter, email's 4-to-1 over Facebook. So it's a massive difference. And I think what that means is Twitter is a place where a lot of casual relationships have formed. And you see this. I mean, the mechanism to connect with someone is so simple. You just click that follow button. There's no opt-in or anything like that. So people take a flyer, and people don't actually have deep engagement or deep relationships with most of the people that they follow on Twitter. And as a whole, I don't think Twitter is necessarily the greatest indication. A Twitter following is the greatest indication of the amount of trust a reporter's built up or their credibility. It's just a signal that they've got a few people to click a button and follow along.
And is it more, in your mind, an information tool or a marketing tool?
I think people use it as a marketing tool. I think because so many people use it as a marketing tool, it actually becomes somewhat worthless as a marketing tool. I think the real potential of Twitter is as an information tool. Like if I had to make a pitch today to a reporter on why they should join, it's less about marketing your stories and spreading the word about what you're doing, and more about finding ways to sort of listen to what other people are saying and what they're looking for, and finding good sources of information than anything else.
You're primarily, at this point, focused on international news, kind of by dint, I guess, of who the freelancers are that are working for you. Do you see this kind of a model working on the local level? Obviously, local media has been decimated, small town newspapers folding.
It's one of the most encouraging signs to me is that we've had actually Beacon subscribers write in, and they say, can you come to our town and find the reporter? Because I'll transfer my Beacon subscription over to them right now if we can get someone to cover their town.
Scott Campbell from the local newspaper's cringing right now.
We'll get Scott on Beacon. My co-founder Adrian's from Corvallis, which is nearby, and he said one of the things he struggled with as the Oregonians had cutbacks is he feels like the coverage of what happens in Corvallis isn't as good as it used to be. And it's not because there isn't a market for that coverage. HP's in town, there's a hospital in town, there's lots of educated people with some disposable income to support news. The problem is just getting someone there. So I do think, once we leave the pink house again, we'll go to a town, we'll find a person, we will sit in front of the grocery store with them and see if we can sell enough subscriptions for them to make reporting in their town sustainable. Because if we can do that, I think that's an entirely different and really valuable model for expansion.
But isn't that what the old local newspaper was, plus advertising, and didn't work?
I think there are all sorts of costs attached to the legacy model that we don't have to deal with. The incremental cost of us adding a reporter onto Beacon and delivering their work is, it's non-existent. Information can be disseminated freely and instantly anywhere in the world, which is a tremendous advantage for a digital-first publisher.
Let's go back to where all the money comes from for this. Walk us through in simple terms of how you walking out of Facebook, saying, I'm going to do this startup, how do you go about getting the kind of financial support, and what are the stages?
The funding environment now, people have this attitude, I think, that money flows so freely in tech that all you need is the idea. And that's not at all true. We had built and launched the entire site of Beacon in a 3-month period without taking a dime of funding. We flew ourselves to Toronto, where Dimitri's from. We sat in another house in Toronto and spent the summer.
Was that also pink?
It was not pink. It was owned by a man named Opera Bob, though, and he had these giant Canadian, I'm not joking, these giant pair of Canadian underwear just hanging above the kitchen table, like the maple leaf.
Okay.
We have a real knack for finding interesting places to live. Opera Bob, his picture hangs in the pink house now. Anyway, where was I?
You were looking for money.
I was looking for money.
Money and underwear.
So you have to build something. You need traction. You need users before you actually get funded. People with a track record who have had a successful exit, who have sold a company or had a company go public, it's different for them. They can raise a round without necessarily anything put together because they prove themselves. For a first-time entrepreneur, you actually need a very in-depth project and a tremendous degree of traction before you'll really get venture funding. So we launched on September 17th. We were fortunate enough to close a few angels and institutional investment in New York to keep us going. When we joined Y Combinator, that was an additional round of funding after that. And now the goal is to get our growth to the point where it's interesting as a continued investment to keep us going. We have money enough for us three to run for a while, but with any idea, you need to scale it out. So that's the next challenge.
So how do you do that? I mean, how do you say to a funder, here's the potential value of this operation 5 years from now?
It's about selling the big vision. And I think in a lot of cases, the big vision is BS for a lot of startups out there, and they run into trouble. But for us, we really do believe it. And the big vision for Beacon, more than anything, is if this model works for journalism, if it works for foreign news, there's no reason it doesn't work for science news, for health news, for some of these other areas. But if it works for journalism in general, there's no reason it doesn't work for political cartoonists or for photographers or for even people who do serialized fiction or poetry. Really, what we're trying to build is if you walk that back and you challenge that fundamental assumption that content needs to be free, as in no cost to you, what would the web look like if we hit that reset button? And in my mind, it would look like something like this. There's a minimum subscription to get in, and then you're part of this community of people who are willing to pay for content, who are willing to support creators that they care about. And I think there are opportunities to sort of help them fund more work above and beyond just that simple subscription if we're able to hit that scale. So that's the argument you have to make on the VC side, and that's sort of the vision you have to sell. And the truism is that growth eliminates everything. So as long as your growth is trending in the right direction, they generally don't ask too many questions. And we've been fortunate enough to be growing at a healthy clip.
When you say funding additional things, is this a cost-plus model? I mean, I pay my $5. I can follow, Jim Jones, the reporter, and another cohort within the organization, but I can pay extra for others, or I'm incentivizing them. What does that look like?
So again, we don't have a mechanism to do this currently, but we've had people write in and say, I support this reporter, but through the course of reading Beacon, I discovered I love this reporter too. Can I pay $10 a month? And we're like, well, no, you can buy like a gift subscription, because we just haven't built any functionality out around that. One of the things people always ask when we get on this talk about paid content is, why isn't there a button that just sort of goes across the web, like the Facebook like button, that would let me tip for content that I really enjoy? And there's several reasons to that. On the creator side, there's a lot of friction to actually putting that button on a website. Going back to the idea that journalists aren't technologists, asking them to install a plugin on a site that's maybe someone else even built for them is actually an undertaking. And on the reader side, it's very tough to say, I'm going to go find my credit card, take my credit card out, put the information in, all to give you $1. But if you have a system where everyone's credit card is sort of in, it actually becomes quite simple to do that at Beacon. Like, we could have just a tip button at the end of an article that when you get to the bottom and you're blown away by it, it just adds $1 onto the subscription, and that goes to the creator. Again, these are opportunities that don't really become compelling unless we get to the next level of scale, but it's things we're thinking about.
Give me a sense of scale at the moment. So I'm your best, most productive, most popular reporter. What am I taking home at the end of the month?
So this actually keeps going up month over month, the answer to this question, which is really good. So right before I came here, we closed a project called Climate Confidential, which was 6 reporters, all in the Bay Area, women with 90 years of experience, who banded together to create a micro-publication. And as part of their campaign, they were looking for 800 readers. They ended up with 820. Many people actually paid more than the $5 a month to support them. So the first check we're going to cut them is for $45,000, which is a great first...
For this group?
For this group of 6, which is a great first nest egg to get them started. But roughly half of the subscriptions are reoccurring. So people who have opted to pay $5 a month or $15 a quarter on an ongoing basis. So if they're able to produce stories that people identify with and find valuable, they're going to continue to take home a large sum every single month. On the individual reporter scale, it's a bit smaller. We have folks who are approaching $800, $900 a month that they're taking home from Beacon. So it's a nice pay raise at this point, but I want to get it to the point where it could be someone's full-time job.
Which is Still not much less than what a lot of local reporters are making.
Yeah.
But again, many of yours are overseas. You went to a classic journalism school, you went to Medill. 10 years from now, what does a journalist look like? I mean, is a journalist a brand? Is he or she doing this sort of thing with multiple outlets? What's the evolution?
I think, sadly, staff jobs are going to be tougher to come by. But talking to a lot of freelancers, they're actually okay with that. I wondered if I was going to meet a lot of reluctant freelancers, but people love the lifestyle. They love the freedom. They love the ability to write and experiment about things they want to do. I think major brands who have built up this trust, this credibility, and also a level of digital savvy are going to endure. Like, I'm not too worried about the New Yorker or the New York Times. I think they'll find a way through this. It may be rocky, but they'll find a way through this. And I think that because the tools are so good and plentiful, the barriers to entry to being a journalist have sort of fallen away. So there will be a lot of people who write for multiple places or write as a hobby or have an interest and choose to pursue that. The challenge is going to be, how do you separate the signal from the noise in that and understand who actually knows what they're talking about and who's just sort of a hobbyist on a kick.
Which gets back to media literacy, the idea of understanding how to separate the wheat from the chaff.
I think media literacy is an underappreciated problem. I think that just as much as the struggle to fund and support news impacts the quality of the information that we have. Readers aren't skeptical enough of what they're getting or understand necessarily how to tell what a good story is. And I think that that's the role of the great journalism schools too. Not only to teach the next generation of journalists, but to come up with programs that actually help the public understand what a great story is.
I'm Lawrence Pintak. This is the Murrow Interview. My guest is Dan Fletcher from Beacon.com. We're going to take a break. We'll be back after this.
Along the way in my college career, I learned so many little things. And to this very day, I still use some of those things I learned then. Hello, everybody. I'm Keith Jackson. I'm a proud graduate of Washington State University.
I'm Lawrence Pintak. This is the Murrow Interview, and we're back with my guest, Dan Fletcher, who is the co-founder of Beacon.com, a journalism startup that's going to be big in a couple of months.
I got to say, we're actually beaconreader.com.
I'm sorry, beaconreader.com.
Someday, we're going to buy that beacon.
Okay. So we need to correct everyone who's listening and watching this broadcast. It's beaconreader.com. I stand corrected. Sorry about that. We'd now like to go to some questions from the audience. We are doing a taping here on the Vancouver campus of WSU, and we have students, faculty, and various professionals from the Portland and Vancouver area here in the audience. And if we can go to the first question, introduce yourself.
All right, my name is Luke, and we had a question about social media in schools. You see, as high school students, under restriction from public schools, we're often banned from social media use in school. So most of the social media usage we partake in is after school on our free time, and it's not serious. So what would you say to persuade schools to remove that barrier, and do you think schools should take action?
So just to clarify, you're saying that you can't use social media during school hours.
Correct.
So you can't tweet in the middle of class or
Yeah,
We're
aren't you
on
just
school computers, so we can't use it for schoolwork either.
aren't you just using your phones though? I mean, that's how I would circumvent it.
We don't get reception here.
Oh, that's terrible.
It's pretty sad.
those from AT&T or Verizon who are watching or listening to this broadcast,
Help the kids
there's a
out.
market here.
Yeah, because that was going to be my question. Like, it's been beat into my head that no one your age even uses a computer anymore, that all you use is a phone. I don't necessarily believe that's true either. Look, I think for me to get in this situation, so I'm not an engineer. I don't code. I'm purely a journalist background. A lot of the knowledge that and the lessons I've used for Beacon have come from experimenting and just trying really weird things online. And I do think it's short-sighted for schools to say...
Is that the new catchphrase for Beacon Reader? Really weird things online?
Oh, I hope not. Let's not make a hashtag out of that one. No, Beacon is not weird. All the weird stuff led up to Beacon. No, but I think it's short-sighted of schools to take what's going to be a fundamental means of communication in the future away from students. And like, yes, students are going to do stupid things on social media, but honestly, it's like their job coming out of school in many cases is going to be running social media for a company or for one of these brands. And I would rather them get the stupid things out of their system when they're in high school and no one sees it than getting it out on someone's corporate feed and like actually causing a story around it. I understand why the sensitivities exist, but I think we need to make these tools as broadly available as possible to kids.
And for those listening on the radio, I have an iPad in front of me, and just for those in the audience or on TV who are wondering, yes, I am checking my email and my Facebook account while we're doing the interview. Next question, you have a second question?
Oh, no, I'm good.
Okay,
Thanks,
do we have
Dan.
another question?
My name is Lucas Wiseman. I'm a student here at WSU Vancouver, and I'm in the Murrow minor here. My question is kind of regarding your subscription method for Beacon. Do you think that that creates a bubble atmosphere where people only get the news that they want to hear? So if someone only cares about cat videos, as you mentioned, they aren't going to hear about a revolution happening in Syria, for example. Do you think that a subscription to like a single journalist or a single topic will kind of create that style of news reception?
So what you're describing is something that's been identified as a problem across the web generally, which is this idea of a filter bubble. The idea that the systems of personalization have gotten so good that you're not exposed to anything outside of what you're already comfortable with. There's nothing to challenge your ideas. I think on Beacon specifically, while your experience is tied to one person, that's what I really value about the collective, is that I may come in because I care about Yemen, but I discover a science journalist who I didn't even know beforehand who I really identify with. Or I come in for the Ukraine and I learn about Australia. So I think really what you've identified is something that we'll have to think through on the product side, because as a consumer of news, I certainly want things that challenge my assumptions and don't just cater to my tastes. And there's no reason a recommendation engine can't just throw wildcards at you. I think Netflix does this with theirs. They're very good at knowing what movies you watch, but occasionally they'll just toss you a curveball to see if you respond to it. And to me, like a good news system needs to do the same things. And I think as we build out Beacon, we'll look for ways to do that too.
I was chatting with the head of news at Google not long ago, and we were talking about exactly this problem, that these filters give me what I want to know and what I agree with rather than challenging me, as you're saying. And he was saying that they're now working with the algorithms so that they're bringing in content and stories that are in a broad subject area, but aren't just filtered for your kind of political and preconceived notions.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And I think the challenge will be whether, if the metrics come back and people aren't responding to that the same way, will the tech companies keep it? Like, it does take a commitment, because you know what's going to get clicked. We're very good at determining this. You have to be okay with your metrics suffering a little bit to accomplish that social good.
Well, I mean, this is the fundamental problem, isn't it?
Right.
That metrics drive so much.
Exactly. And I think, part of the reason on the web is that it doesn't matter. We're in a filter bubble on the web anyway, because only certain types of things are getting produced. I want a web in which I don't have to consume stories through a top 10 list or through a series of GIFs. That's okay as entertainment every once in a while, but that can't become the de facto norm.
Next question.
Good morning, Pete Mayer, WSU alum. Question to maybe reflect upon the blurring, if you will, between maybe objective news, fact-based, fact-checked, edited news content, and the growing popularity of op-ed / blogging, often by perhaps the same individual. So in your model, someone subscribing with a specific author or reporter who on one page of that website is objectively reporting news content, and in another providing opinion or satire of a current issue or situation. Can you maybe reflect on how we as consumers, how do we separate that? Should we separate that?
I think, first off, that's a call for news literacy. Again, I think this problem will come up more and more in the future, exactly what was identified there, giving people the tools to separate fact from opinion and understand when they're reading the difference between the two. Jay Rosen has a critique. He's a press critic. He works at New York University, and now he's part of Pierre Omidyar's new news organization. They hired him away. He has a critique of traditional press that it represents the view from nowhere. That in this race to be the most objective, you actually don't end up saying much at all because you strip any sort of context or opinion from it whatsoever. I think what matters to me personally as a reader, and I think what will matter increasingly to readers, is not necessarily someone not having an opinion, it's them not hiding that opinion. And it's having transparency about where their biases lie and the things that they believe. Like, I would much rather understand a reporter's biases coming into a story than knowing in the back of my head that this isn't a robot who's devoid of opinions and information. They have some point of view on what they're reporting. They're just trying really, really hard to subjugate it. So I think, like, for me, I would much rather know that information coming in and have that available to me and judge their work accordingly.
But there is a difference between acknowledging your biases and compartmentalizing them in traditional journalism, and both giving you a report on what happened, and as the questioner pointed out, and giving me your opinion. I don't necessarily want the opinion of the reporter, do I?
I think you may not, but I think plenty of readers do, and I think I just see these distinctions falling away. I mean, to be completely honest, it's not one I spend a ton of time thinking about, because I don't think that's how people behave online necessarily. I think that might be one of the walls that falls away a little bit.
But don't we then move to a place where we are, even more so than now, only consuming media that we agree with, if we know that everything is opinion-based?
I think, again, the challenge needs to be on the reader and the providers of news to find ways to deliver facts and opinions that challenge someone's assumptions. I think there needs to be some element of responsibility on the reader here as well to sort of challenge themselves and to search outside of it. That doesn't always exist, and where it doesn't exist, I think these services with their tremendously powerful algorithms and understanding of reader behavior can help in some way if they choose to.
Next question.
Hi, my name is James Kiernan. I go to iTech here, and I was wondering what you plan on doing to capture the wide audience of people like my dad who are legacy media readers, so they only read newspapers and magazines, physical stuff. What do you plan on doing to capture that audience and converting them to the digital media world?
I think first we have to focus on capturing more of the digital audience first. Like, I would love to feel that we were so good at this that I would come and chase your dad. Again, I think most people are going to consume their information through the web in some form, whether that's through a Kindle, tablet, computer, phone. That's going to be the primary way that people receive information in the future. Like, that just seems inevitable to me. I would love to have like a Beacon anthology that we print at the end of the year, partially because I still love print and enjoy reading things in print. But I don't think that can be our primary focus. I think we've got to move forward with digital.
Well, and you know, as we look at newspapers today, we have, I mentioned before, we have Peter Boccia, the outgoing editor of the Oregonian, in the audience, and they've scaled back their home delivery, and that's obviously a first step toward scaling back print production. So aren't people like his father going to ultimately be forced to move digital?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that seems pretty clear to me.
Next question.
Hi, thanks first
And
for being here.
Sorry, this will be our last question, okay?
Thank you again for being here. Appreciate the time, especially for being at WSU. I'm a WSU Cougar alumni, also president of the local Economic Development Council. Two-part questions, both related to geographic location. When you decide to move out of the Pink House, what are the factors that your business is going to be looking at in where you decide to call home next? And second, how does geographic location tie into the reporters and the need there? You talked a little bit about some of the local advantages that reporters have. How does geography change in your business model?
To answer the first part of your question, where would we base Beacon when we're done with the Pink House? Thank God. I think it really is a decision in terms of the network of people sort of supporting the company. I think, for better or worse, one of the virtues of Silicon Valley is this attitude to really go for it, to not do things halfway, to look for that really big vision and find the people who are going to encourage you to get there. That's not a mentality that exists necessarily in other parts of the country, and it's a really strong argument why so many tech companies end up basing themselves there. With regards to your question about reporter geography and things like that, we haven't necessarily had a strategy around it yet, but again, I think you can look at how social networks have grown in the past. One of the genius moves in Facebook's early days was the gradual spread from college to college to college. it created this air of exclusivity around it. It created this excitement when Facebook came to your campus and you could finally unlock it because you heard about your friend at Harvard who had it, and then you heard about your friend at Stanford who had it. And for me, like, that's sort of the strategy you do with local too. If I know that the town next door to me has awesome news coverage and that these 4 people are providing it in this town, I'm going to try and figure out a way to get that here. And when that town comes online, that's really strengthening the offer for everyone, because now it's 2 towns online, and they're going to be curious what's happening next door as well. So for me, like, any geography strategy is going to take a cue like that. You start in one place and you sort of broaden out from there.
Dan, thanks so very much. It's been great talking to you. The hashtag for this interview is #MurrowInterview. Thanks also to Jack and Jan Creighton for their ongoing support for this show. Thanks also to WSU Vancouver Chancellor Mel Netzhammer for hosting us here. And thanks to all of you here in the audience and at home. For the Murrow Interview, I'm Lawrence Pintak. Thanks so much.
Good night, and good luck.